Motorsport is changing constantly, whether it be through regulation changes that push the series into a certain direction, safety improvements that make it safer for the drivers to handle their cars on the limit, or the use of new technology to help the teams improve their cars faster. And one key aspect that becomes more and more important for the teams is the use of software to gain valuable information from the data their cars collect while driving. Because inside all of these signals and numbers hide valuable chunks of information that can actually win you races. But before we get into how software can help teams win races, let's first have a look into the history of data in motorsport. And if you're thinking why we first have to talk about data before we come to software, it is simply because software is pretty useless if it has no data to work with. Because the idea of collecting data to improve the car's performance is nothing new in motorsport. In fact, motorsport has always collected data. The only difference to today is that it wasn't that much that was collected in the first few years, and that it wasn't collected by computers, but rather by humans that wrote it down on paper. And so in the 1950s and 1960s, you would see some people with a clipboard and a pen and paper to write down the lap times of the drivers, because it was basically the only way you could collect data. Most of the time, this job was done by the partners of the drivers. But because the teams couldn't really collect any data, the teams heavily relied on the drivers to tell them if they had to change something on the setup or if something was broken on the car. That is also why the drivers needed to be very good at interpreting these signals from their cars, because if they made a mistake or misinterpreted a signal, it could actually mean that they would have to retire from the event. A good example for this is Bruce McLaren's little mistake at the 1967 Monaco Grand Prix when he pitted because of misfire, which he thought to have come from low fuel. When Jack Brabham later pointed that out to him, he rejoined the race and was able to finish fourth. So you can see that this could even happen to the best of drivers. The first real time that computers were used in motorsport was in the 1970s. But because computing power was back then very expensive and wasn't really large, they were only used in a small manner. And one of the first series to use computers wasn't Formula 1, but rather IndyCar. Yep, Formula 1 wasn't always the series to use new technologies. The IndyCars back then were able to collect 14 different pieces of information that could be downloaded in the pit lane by the team. The rise of computers in the 1980s also had its influence on motorsport. Teams and engine manufacturers started to use electronic systems to improve the car's reliability, its performance, and also fuel efficiency. But because the memory inside the car was so small and they couldn't send back some telemetry back to the pits either, they only could save one lap of information. So the teams had to tell the drivers via the pit board when they could switch on the telemetry so that they wouldn't collect too much data and override the small memory cell in the car. Late in the 1980s, the teams started to use radio signals in order to transfer some information back to the pits when the cars were on the start-finish straight. That was also called burst information, because the engineers only would get a small amount of data that they could work with before the cars would come back into the pits and they could actually see the rest of the information that was collected. The peak of computing power came in the 1990s. Electronic systems like ABS, traction control, or active suspension were introduced, and they changed the way the drivers handled their cars. And all these new systems meant that the cars would collect more data, which they could finally send back to the pits. Better technologies were introduced to download and stream more data in less time, which not only meant that the teams could gather more information in the garage, but also could send some information back to the factory where a second part of the team could actually work on this data while the car was still on track. And nowadays, series like Formula 1 collect tons of data and send it back in no time. Teams have their own departments because they have so many people that are just there to analyze and make the right decisions from all the data that is sent back to the pits while the car is still on the circuit. So F1 teams have basically become a software company that has a race team as a side hustle. But how do modern Formula 1 cars even collect all of this data, and how do they send it back to the pits? Data from a race car is collected in many different ways and forms. To measure this data, teams use a variety of sensors on the different parts of the car. These sensors can measure things like speed, force, RPM, torque, pressure, and much more. And for all of these different types of data, you also need a different type of measurement. But I do not want to make this too complicated, so we're only going to focus on one sensor, and I'm going to explain the process on this one. The sensor we're going to focus on might be known to some of you as it is placed pretty prominently on the front of the car. It is this little tube on the front of the car called the pitot tube. It is used to measure the airspeed and comes in various different ways, but they all basically work the same. The sensor works with the differential pressure of the fluid inside the tube. The sensor then transfers the data to the system that needs it, either via cables or, in newer cars, via the CAN bus, which is basically a for vehicle standardized way to communicate primarily with the bus system. If the information from the sensor is not critical, the system sends the data to a data logger, which then puts it onto an SD card, which the engineers can then plug into their computers when the car's back in the pits. Things like the RPM are sent from the data logger onto the display in the cockpit so that the driver can see them. If the sensor is used to measure a critical value, this information is sent from the data logger onto the antennas of the car, which then transfer it back to the garage so that the teams can have an eye on it while the car is still out. When the car comes back to the pits, the engineers can connect their laptops via USB or Ethernet port. From there, the data engineers can prepare the information mathematically and graphically so that you can understand what it says to you. In our example with the pitot tube, we measured the airspeed, which we need to get the absolute vehicle speed, which is very important for the aerodynamicists, because the absolute vehicle speed can tell the aerodynamicists with which speed the air goes over or under the wings of the car or the diffuser. And so you can see if the car, for example, gets a tail or a headwind. And just to clarify, headwind gives you more downforce and tailwind gives you less downforce. But I mean, this is all fine. But how does this actually help me win races? From the computers in the simulator to the software that can tell you the changes in the weather or the temperature, the modern technology basically gives you the possibility to have an eye on every relevant factor of a session. But if all the teams collect so much data, how can it be possible that some teams fight for the podium regularly while others are even trying to get a point? This is because the real challenge lies in making the right decisions from all this data. You can collect as much data as you want and have the best software to analyze it. If the people that make the decisions draw the wrong conclusions from all of this data, it can put you even more on the back foot than it helps you. So data not only gives you the possibility to improve your car's performance, but to put you even more on the back foot. That is why you need the right people to work with this data, because they can be a small part to decide the direction of where the team is heading in the future, which makes computer scientists or mathematicians more valuable for racing teams than ever before. And while we're on this topic, how is the future of software and data collecting in motorsport going to look? As it seems like new innovations might have the potential to transform the sport in multiple dimensions. Better data analysis tools could give teams the opportunity to fine-tune their strategies even more, which could lead to strategies evolving lap by lap, as they already kind of do, but with even more detail. Future technologies could help teams to build more prototypes virtually, speeding up the pace of innovation in engineering, but this might be more reserved for series like Formula 1, which are the peak when it comes to finding new technical innovations. But also the way you, as a fan, can experience motorsport might be changed by software, with things like augmented or virtual reality that can bring you even closer to the action than ever before. For example, you could be able to experience the race live from the cockpit via virtual reality. And if you want to learn more about technical revolutions, check out this video where I've talked about how Formula E has got rid of its classical rear brakes. Thank you for watching and see you next time.